We're live.
Live.
Good morning. Good
Good
day.
day.
Good afternoon.
Noon.
First of all, a huge welcome to the second community session of How Can Data-Driven Planning Create More Inclusive Urban Environments? I'm Pernille Berg, a Science Manager of BLOXHUB. It is a huge pleasure to welcome you to today's community session with a program filled with both research and practice, just as we love it. New knowledge and profound experiences in what works, and maybe also what we still need to make work. What is BLOXHUB to all of you joining us from the world? BLOXHUB is a public-private partnership created by Realdania, Copenhagen City Ministry and Trade of Industry, and is the manifestation of what this event is about: innovation and collaboration across borders. Who are we? We're an ecosystem of knowledge and solutions with the aim of creating better cities worldwide. What do? We support innovation through our programs, share knowledge through debates and science talks, and bring solutions to challenge owners worldwide. We think this is important because we need to speed up implementation of existing solutions by supporting cross-sector and cross-border collaboration. We see the need for collaboration and networks much more than ever through our fill spaces, eager members, and curious partners. Christina.
Thank you. I'm also very happy to be here today, be here with you, Pernille, and to welcome everybody to this community session. My name is Christina Haupt-Toft, and I'm part of the Danish ConTech Lab, which stands for Construction Technologies. ConTech Lab is a collaboration between the two big Danish foundations, Realdania and the Industry Foundation, and is initiated by the Danish Construction Information Center, Molio. I guess we all know that the construction industry is characterized by fragmentation. There are many actors who have to work together before a construction is completed. And in ConTech Lab, we have a we are learning ground where we combine the deep understanding for the construction processes with new technology and digital working methods. So we go out on concrete projects together with the companies of the industry, and we try out new ways of working, new ways of collaborating with the help of technology and digitization. And it doesn't matter to us which technology we work with. It can be robot technology or sensors or, it can be a lot of different things. But the important thing is that we work around the issue and the pains of the construction processes. And the pains are often the collaboration between the companies of the industry and the shift of phases where we go from construction to facility management or renovation to come in the years. It's very important that we have a more holistic approach to this work. The outcome of our projects we try to share with the whole industry, hopefully we can make a more systemic change in the future. We're working with all kinds of parties of the construction industry. We work with builders, architects, engineers, contact companies, major contractors, small craftsmen, and we're doing it together with all the great initiatives across the industry. And that is why we're also standing here together with BLOXHUB today in yet another great collaboration. Because it is our belief that cross-sectoral collaboration and collaboration at all is like the most important part of unfolding this big potential of creating a more sustainable construction industry. And that is both in terms of environmental change, social change, and economic change. And that leads us back to the subject of today: how can data-driven planning create more inclusive urban environments? And with us today we have Jan Saar, who is Head of Digital Construction Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communication in Estonia. Welcome, Jan. Great to have you with us today.
Hi, Pernille. Hi, Christina. It's great to be here virtually with you in Denmark. And I know the ministry where I work at is a mouthful, so I often mix it up myself as well.
Jan was moderating yesterday's community session, super exciting community session. And you're here today, Jan, with us to try to tie the threads between the two sessions. So I would like to start out by asking you if you can sum up the key takeaways from yesterday's session.
Yeah, I mean, yesterday we had a blast. We had a great event. We had 4 fantastic speakers. We had Andres Sevchuk from MIT. He's an associate professor of urban science there. And he started off by talking about, how to really use data in specific projects. In his experience that they've done in Australia, for example, in US, great examples on how pedestrian movement data can be used. Then we had Raul Kalvo from Infisika Technology from Estonia, and he was kind of continuing the presentation that Andres did, and also talked about 3 specific projects where they used data to analyze, how to modify urban development. And the other 2 presenters were maybe a bit more practical. We had Christian Lepik, who is the founder of Teleport, a service that helps to move talent, to helps people find the best city for them. And he was talking about the experience he had building this service, which is now part of Topia. And we finished off with Raul and Daniel from Spacemaker, which is already a very mature tool that you can use to actually do the planning, do the analysis, do simulations based on data about the built environment. And all of it is geared toward making the better environment a better urban environment for all of us, and how to really use data. And we had a great discussion as well afterwards, after the presentations, focusing on really the accessibility of open data and how to put it into good use. So I recommend everybody, if you didn't manage to catch it yesterday, we will have the recording will be online, so you can catch it up later.
Thank you very, very much. And it was indeed a really, really wonderful and interesting community session yesterday. We heard, now you've shared with us some of the great examples. What do you see after yesterday as the most unmet potential of how data can create a better and more sustainable built environment?
Well, I think the question is really about people, that we need to get these tools, this data, into the hands of the decision makers, because we have so many already great research projects, startups who are focusing on this. There's a lot of technology already to visualize all of this data, but what we need is to make the actionable steps and take it to the decision makers in local authorities, in governments, and also real estate developers, to really look at not only maybe in a single project context, but look at all projects in a bigger context, in a bigger urban environment, and look at the surroundings and how people move and actually how data moves. So I think that's the biggest untapped potential yet, because this is a relatively still to many people a new field, although the data's been around for ages. And we had an example also yesterday that Andres mentioned, how in US they started standardizing the way car traffic is moving and how the streets are mapped, and that really laid the groundwork for everything that we have now today with Google Maps, etc. And stuff like this has been around, but for example for pedestrians, it's nothing like that yet exists in a standardized form. But we really need to continue to work and push this for the decision makers.
I think it's an excellent point. So thank you very, very much, Jan, to help us in creating a bridge from yesterday's community session to today's. And I don't think I will disappoint anyone by saying that the keynote speakers and the panelists today will address exactly some of those salient points that you've just raised. So thank you so much, Jan, for helping us get off to a great start today. We have, as I have now mentioned, an interesting program today with interesting people. Before I take you through the program, I'd like you to welcome you to our wonderful platform. And for those of you who are visiting Brillo for the first time, you will notice that it has a lot of different functions. It has a wonderful chat function, and I have a brilliant colleague, Jakob Norman Hansen, who is our chat host today. In order to participate in the chat, you have to do it through the stream. So if you're watching us live from the mainframe, if we could persuade you to participate through stream, that way we can engage you in our chat function. The other wonderful feature of Brillo is also that there is a matchmaking session going on. You can network and reach out to all of these wonderful people that are participating. So I highly encourage you to do that. So the program is intense. We will have 2 keynote speakers. I promise you, you will be inspired. And then we also have a nice recipe. We'll have a keynote. We'll have a panel debate, because we also need to debate some of these things that Jan has already raised. What this means is that you will actually get time to ask questions to the keynote speakers, because we have made sure that they will stay with us. So you don't have to hurry or feel stressed. We have time to make sure that your questions will be heard and addressed. First, I would like to welcome Jakob Strømmen Andersen, Director of Innovation and Sustainability. He will now join me as we say thank you to Christina.
You. The stage is all yours,
for helping me open this community session in a lively and wonderful fashion. It was something that we have looked forward to doing. And Jakob, you're Director of Innovation and Sustainability and at the high-profile Danish architect company Henning Larsen. But you're also, as partner and Director of Innovation and Sustainability, you also manages your unique industrial PhD program. This is how we have gotten to know each other. And I know that you have focused so much in the last few years on the interaction between engineering, architecture, and modern technology. So you have not only a passion, but you also have vast international experience exactly through these cross-disciplinary collaborations. And you will today share with us your experiences, whether data can actually play a pivotal part in designing appealing urban spaces. And we're looking very much forward to that. So thank you. I will now leave the podium and let you talk. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Pernille. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here and always happy to have a nice introduction by Pernille. I'm a partner at Henning Larsen Architects at Design Studio, but actually I'm a trained engineer, so I love numbers and I love talking about data. But I promise today not to show too much numbers or too many numbers, but show how data actually can affect what we do at the studio every day, how we can affect the design that we do in an urban scale. I have a 20 minutes presentation, and as Pernille said, please feel free to add comments. I will be here all day to be able to answer and also be part of the panel discussion. But why are we all here? Because we know that the city are growing. In 2050, 7% of the people will live in cities. That means that we need to build a city of the size of 1.5 million every day. So, or not every day, but every week. That means there's a lot of job for all of us here today, but also a lot of job for architects. But in the same way, we also know that we have a huge challenge in front of us. There's an environmental challenge. We know that the building industry counts for almost 40% of the CO2 emission. So the big question is, how can we as an industry take responsibility for these changes, for this urbanization in a sustainable way? That's also why we are here together at BLOX today. At Henning Larsen, we see data as one of the key for that. We have a lot of questions and dreams and vision we ask when we go into a design process. But the data is what makes the impact, how we can document the impact on the environment, on the culture of the city, but also the business as we do it. We need also to talk about how data can create business for the architectural or the design community. When we are working with data, it's not only about numbers, it's about how we bring the numbers together. We often see data as notes, but it's about playing the right notes at the right time, otherwise the music will be terrible. For us it can be everything from a classic concert with a lot of instruments playing together and one conductor in the end. But sometimes it's also more like a rock concert where you kind of give it full power from the start and you are sweaty during the whole process. But it can never be a one-man band. It always needs to be co-created together with different professions. But data is the key that can bring that together. At Henning Larsen we have a design process. In old days we got a program brief in the door and we start sketching. We took the napkin and the pen and we start sketching how does this look like. Now we have a process where design and architecture is a big part of it. But the first step is to understand data. This is where we start. And that can be data going out to the site, taking pictures, talking with people, but it's also about collecting data, about environmental data, demography data, data about the business case. And from the data we build up what we call a strategic design concept. It's not a drawn concept, it's a written concept. But it's a concept that we all agree on with the client, all the consultancy in the team. It's something that also we can go out and measure in the end when we deliver the design, where we can all say we delivered that impact. Is defined in the strategic design concept. This is the vision and the why we are doing this project. And then we go into the architectural concept. What is it? How does it look like? The communication, the storytelling, and the last end, the validation, the post-occupancy evaluation. I brought 2 examples today of how that actually influences the design case. This first one is a small park in Esbjerg. It's a west coast city in Denmark. It's a very rough city. It's an industrial city. It's near to the west coast. We were designing this in the red part of it. There was a park there from old days. It need to be, no one really used that park, so it need to be opened up and it need to be renovated and transformed. As I said, Esbjerg is an old fisherman's village. There are still the fish markets on the harbor, but it's also turned into a more like a oil and gas industry. We have a lot of offshore industry, and we have a lot of those guys on the right-hand side in Esbjerg. So the first thing that we did was going out over there and read the kind of the very rough city as it was, and try to explain that or translate that into a design case. And then we got back and we start sketching and understand how that could look like. But in this case, we a bit forgot the strategic design concept, and we also a bit forgot how to bring in data. So we brought in this guy, is our secret joker, is Christer Jens. He's our industrial PhD. He's been part of that what Pernille said, the cluster here at Blocks, the last PhD cluster about urban design. He's a German, so he loves data. He loves bringing in data. So what he did was to go a bit back and try to understand what kind of data is related to Esbjerg and what can we bring this data forward in the design process. And some very simple one that he got, he went to statistics data and saw there was actually an overpopulation of lonely men in Esbjerg compared to women. A lot of men between 25 and 35 living alone in Esbjerg. And then we also went over there and talked with the city. Why is that? And that's basically because of the offshore industry. But what they also said that this was a really big demography issue for Esbjerg because of the balance in kindergarten, in retail, in schools. So they really want to challenge that case. And we also ask when those men goes to the nightclub and come home with a woman, the lucky guys that find a woman in the nightclub, what do they do? They move to Ribe, they said, because Ribe is a more cozy city. It's very next door. I think it's 20 kilometers from Esbjerg. So when they get a family, they move to Ribe and establish the family there. So that was an issue for Esbjerg, and that turned down our whole design concept for going for a very rough concept to a more feminine concept. So we started, instead of putting steel and concrete in, we putting rose gardens. We're putting pathways where 2 strollers could walk beside each other, and we kind of modified the whole garden to be more feminine and open to the public. And we actually won that project by doing that. And one comment from the mayor was also that this was not only a park that was transformed or renovated or upgraded. This was actually a park for whole Esbjerg that wanted to change the demography of Esbjerg, did something bigger than only doing a park. And I think that is a storytelling also about data and project and design. We are looking for the effect not only on the plot, what we design for, but the whole community and the whole city. Another case is Fælleby or Vejlandskvarteret. It's a new development. It's a very kind of discussed project. It's just outside here in Copenhagen. It's a project that we won 2 years ago. The idea here was to combine the scale of the city with the scale of the village and create a new typologies in the kind of the outskirt of Copenhagen that brought in nature and brought in people and city in a new typography. We created like 3 different kind of villages or 3 kind of structures where we have this plaza in the center, and it's open up to nature, and the nature is kind of taking in or growing into the structure. What we also did here, it seems like a very kind of sketchy project. It's very kind of felt, and the idea here was also not only to do kind of a visionary concept, but also bring in data to optimize it in regard to the KPIs or the data that we need to be able to document. And one of the things that was a major issue here was nature. How can we actually build the square meters that we need to build and bring in more nature at the same time? So that was the KPIs. I think that is so. Can I go one back? I don't know. Can I get one? I try to get one back here. The idea here was, I can get one back here. On the right-hand side, you see this was a generative design algorithm that was optimizing the structure. We did around 10,000 iterations at the same time we were designing. This is Marie sitting at the office designing while we are running those generative design studies. And we were doing them together with HD Lab that actually are placed here in a startup here in BLOXHUB. And the idea here was, as I said, the density. We need to optimizing the density at the same time, free up more space, but still keep in the quality. And one of the qualities was view to nature. It was the comfort around the building, wind comfort, and then was also daylight that we doesn't have to build that dense that we cannot provide daylight into the buildings. What the findings was here that actually we could improve the view to nature, we could improve the urban comfort or daylight condition, and same time free up 1 more hectare of nature. And that was only done by bringing in data in that design process. It was not something that we could read from the design and optimize. It was running those 10,000 iterations with data, and we could actually improve the whole design concept and the output, the effect of it. The next step here, what we're doing here is optimizing daylight condition. We have this big structure that is very the geometry is very kind of complex. So every apartment, every room have a different kind of view to nature and neighboring buildings, and that should be reflected in the way that we design the facades. So here we did all those daylight combinations, and we combined it with different facade typologies. We have all those 5 different facade typologies, and we have all those daylight simulation. And that is how we kind of get the variation into the design. The ambition for this whole project is a timber construction with lightweight facades. We run those, I think it was 9,000 different daylight simulation. And what we are looking into now here, this is one of our good friend Theodore. He's looking into how AI can actually, how this big catalog of data now is daylight simulation, how that this actually can, instead of we are running those simulations over and over again, we can bring that into a system where we actually can predict the result while we are designing, like our augmented architects, that actually we don't have to wait and run those simulations that can take sometimes also in the communication, but actually we click on a button and then we have the daylight condition and we can design from that. So that is the next step where we're looking, how can we actually use that, all the data we have now, and bring it into our smarter systems. But the question here was, and I think also that is something that we can discuss afterward, can data-driven algorithm create beauty in the world? I think maybe not. That is not the answer. But it can definitely qualify the ideas that we have, and it can definitely qualify the effect that we create. The last thing I want to show you is some of our small tools at Henning Larsen. We are very much into open source platform. We are very much into what we call augmented architects, that we implement tools into the design process. We don't have a package you have to go to a special person to be able to run those simulations, but we create those small scripts while we are designing and together with the client. This one is a parking script. We have solar action, we have the daylight. We have one that is a pathfinder that can find the quickest route to a destination. We have developed a quick noise simulation, so we can move around with the building and get urban noise, and we have water runoff simulations. But at the same time, it's also good to have this like a physical understanding of modeling. Here is landscaping. This is our sandbox. It's a project with Marius, that is a PhD from Dicile, is part of the Ramble group. The whole idea, everyone have maybe tried the sandbox at the experimentarium, tried to play with the sandbox. So that is not the fancy thing here. The fancy thing is the computer in the back. So actually what this does is monitoring the topography in the sandbox and translate it directly into a Rhino model. So we can model in the sandbox and we can bring that data into digital platform and work with that data into the landscape process, and we can also do water runoff, we can do soil balance and all kind of different stuff by bringing that data out of the sandbox. So again, just to sum up, we see data as one of the key design drivers to actually monitoring and the effect that we create. And the effect is the important thing also, as we see in the future for architecture. It's not so much about how it looks like, but much more what it can do for the city, for the people, and also for our business. And just to sum up, I brought this nice guy here that have 3 visions for how we can actually, what is the data that we are looking at and what should we be focusing on, the 3 ideas. The most sustainable city is the one that doesn't get built. I just said that we need to build a city for 1.5 million every day, but we also have square meters out there, and we need to understand how those square meters better can be utilized, and we can use data for that. So it's about understanding that we have a lot of square meters out there. How can we actually transform them to give a better performance? The next one, the most sustainable city is a city that never sleeps. It talks about also, again, the efficiency of square meters. We saw under the pandemic, all the business districts were totally empty. What a waste of square meters, what a waste of resources. How can actually this, also the pandemic, actually reinvent the use of square meters? Also the programmatic, how can we try to combine retail, housing, residential, and commercial into new typologies? We had a discussion. We just designed a school in Aarhus, just in the city center of Aarhus. The school is empty from 5 o'clock in the evening. Why not do this as a GLS storage center in the nighttime, where they bring all the package into the city center of Aarhus and then distribute it in the morning? Just to think about how can those business cases be set up, how can we kind of cut off those defined typologies and open up for more dynamic typologies. And the last one, the most sustainable future is the one that penalty over design. We need to understand how we can get the most out of the resources. We are blowing up the ecological budget every year. We need to be able to perform better for less resources. And here we can also use data to understand how we actually can design better with the resources that we already have. So also this is just my question for the next panel, also for you guys here. How can data create positive effects? What is your best advice? I said also, Peter, you said it sometimes, data is good, but it's not good if you don't know how to translate it into an effect, how to use that data. So I'd like to hear what is your good advice and what is your example of the good way of using data. Thank you, Pernille.
Absolutely formidable, Jakob.
Was it on time and everything?
Was just,
okay, perfect.
You're on the second, on the dot. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And wow, have you left us with so much to discuss. Now, you wonderful people participating out there, we will give you a few seconds to reflect as we get the stage ready for our panelists. So I will be quiet as you type your questions or comments, and see you in only a few seconds. A smooth transition it was. And as we welcome our panelists to the stage, I will actually start anti-clockwise, because to me on my right, I'm going to welcome Daniel Gamero, Architect and Technical Sales Operations Manager of Spacemaker, because you're joining us virtually. So to make sure that you feel just as welcome as everyone else, a huge welcome to you, Daniel, and you'll get your opening question in just a few seconds. And then we have, to my immediate left, Peter Bjørn Larsen, CEO, Smart City Insights. Peter is the owner of Smart City Insights and a global expert in urban innovation ecosystems, and in particular in smart city and data business models. So I think we're in very capable hands as we're going further along the discussion in just a few moments. And then we have Mohammed Al-Mahmoud, Assistant Professor in Architecture and Urban Design, Imam Abdulrahman bin Faisal University. I've rehearsed so much to say perfectly.
You're doing very well.
Thank you, Mohammed. Mohammed is a dear acquaintance and friend of mine, because Mohammed is, as Christa Jens mentioned by Jakob Strømmen just earlier, is also part of the Smart City Research Network and finished your postdoc a year ago.
That's true.
So it's very nice to see you today. As an architect and urban designer, Mohammed has a lot of extensive expertise in the interface between city planning and human-centered design. And you focus on integrating urban design and research through evidence-based approach. So that should be very good. And then Peter Weisman, Technical Development Manager from NCC, also a member of the Smart City Research Network, namely as a company supervisor to a third research project. So we have extremely qualified people with us here today. Peter is trained as a civil engineer and working with NCC, which stands for Nordic Construction Company, and has a PhD from Danish Technical University. Your focus, Peter, is on cross-cutting and holistic approach to design in the early stages. And already quoted, but it's a beautiful mantra: data is nothing if it doesn't ensure an action. That will resonate very well, I think. And as promised, you wonderful people, your first question from me will be a reflection as you introduce yourself on the question, why is data important in ensuring the creation of sustainable solution? And Daniel, we're going to start with you to welcome you to Copenhagen virtually.
Thank you everyone for having me. I'm hearing a little bit of feedback, but I will do my best to ignore it. So I think data is very important because it's the facts, right? It's information. We need information to take good decisions. But my interest there is actually how we process that data. What do we do with all of this information? And I'm very interested when this information becomes a common language where all stakeholders can be very honest and transparent about their interests, and they can agree on a common goal, on a common framework to develop better cities. That's really what I'm very interested about. It's when real estate developers, architects, planning authorities, but also the people that already inhabit that space can use data to have better discussions between themselves, to agree what kind of development they should do at that point. So we have focused very much about data availability yesterday, but I'm also very interested on the accessibility, right? Not having it only available for the experts, the people that can and use generative design, for example, every day, but I'm interested on putting that knowledge in the hands of everyone that participates and builds the cities that we live in.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. I already have a few questions that I'm curious to ask you, but I will not do that right now. Peter, to my immediate left, because we have two Peters, I'm also sure that this inspired you as well.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we all agree it's, when we talk about data and the urban context, it's about to understand the context of an area, of a city, and so on. But I think we kind of scratched the surface now. So it was a good presentation by Jakob and from Henning Larsen that described the details you can get, but you can actually get one step deeper. So when we normally work, we draw a circle around an area and we try to say, what do we actually want to know about this area? And I've noted one thing is that how can data actually bring beauty into the world? It can help to understand what does beauty mean from different people. So that's just one example how important that can be. The other thing I would say is we need to be better at connecting big data and pathology. They can be explain a lot. So big data, we can measure things, how things move around, but why are we taking those choices? That's the next one. And there's good ways to connect that. There's a lot more to say, and I know Anders from Backscatter is coming on afterwards, so I really like what they are doing, so I'm not going to touch upon that now. So, a lot more to say, but
it bodes well for our debate. It's wonderful. Mohammed, your reflection on the opening question, and welcome to the debate.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. As an architect and urban designer, I think for me data is a sniffing sense of what does the place mean. And as Jakob mentioned in his presentation, beauty, and I agree with Peter, what does beauty mean and it's for whom? And always, as an urban designer who's engaged both in research and as well as in practice, I think of public spaces in terms of for whom, who is the user of public space, and how can we generate data or use data to understand the DNA of the user. And you mentioned in the intro, Pernilla, that I was part of the Smart City Research Cluster. I was involved as an industrial postdoc in a project that aims to simulate public life in space and time. And the aim is to use pedestrian data as a way to simulate the everyday life in the public spaces, and in order to create a virtual living lab that allows us to test and examine the various design proposals from a user perspective and from a human perspective. So for me, data is a representation of human in the urban design process. And then it's the voice of people in the urban design process. It could be active and it could be passive voice. So that's where I actually approach data in the urban design and architecture field.
Interesting. And I think this, I think Daniel and Mohammed, you'll have things to discuss in just a few moments. But Peter, to my very far left, you should also be allowed to reflect on the opening questions.
Yes. Well, I want to start as somewhere completely different. I have been a professional engineer for almost 20 years now, and along those, all throughout, it has always been about a little more computer power, being able to calculate a little more, being able to do a little more with the tools that we have, and being able to integrate BIM models and thermal simulations and stuff like that, which is what I'm concerned with. That doesn't really give us anything other than a little better calculation or a little better simulation. So when 4 or 5 years ago we discovered that there's a whole new source of information that we can start to use, namely data from buildings in operation, and I'm switching a little bit focus here. The other has been very much focused on urban design and use in urban practices. When I talk about data, my definition is knowledge from buildings in operation, where we try to extract what is going on in that building as much as we can. And using that, I saw that there was a whole new approach to how can we actually get a new knowledge and a new basis for doing design, where we can both use the current building and how improve the operation of that, and at the same time use the same data to improve the design of the next building, of the renovation or the refurbishment of a current building. All of that in once, if we know how to do it. And that is actually what I'm concerned with, is how can we make this something, this duality of data, both in operation and in design, how can we use that as good as we can?
Excellent, and I think it ties in very well to something that Jakob has also mentioned in earlier interviews, so I'm going to save some of the thoughts that I'm getting right now for our second debate when Jakob will be joining us. But one of the things that I thought was quite nice, and I'm looking to you, Daniel, even though I'm actually going to refer to Jan Saab, because when he reflected on this morning's session, he actually highlighted from yesterday's debate that we know a lot about motor vehicles and their data transmission, and a lot of the infrastructure historically throughout the industrialization period has been based on extensive data on transportation means, but not on pedestrian. And I was thinking in terms of the loop back to you, Mohammed, that exactly what you have been researching is actually, and I know this because we have talked about this previously, but Mohammed has actually, around the clock, throughout the seasons, been observing behavior. And then you have plotted in that data. A thing to remember is that data doesn't just come from nothing. There is actually, you have to observe to compile the data or ensure sensors. So Daniel, because you participated yesterday as well, and when you mentioned just earlier in terms of how we process the data, how we ensure the level of transparency, one of the things that I was thinking, you talk about accessibility, that the data is available, and thanks to Mohammed, we actually have data on pedestrian patterns. But the accessibility, what would your take be on how to ensure that data is accessible?
I think that's the 1 million question, right? It's very hard to ensure accessibility. What we know very well is that it's very easy to manipulate data. If I want to build up a story, I can very easily collect the facts that support my vision. And accessibility to data, it's power, right? It gives me the possibility to manipulate the whole population, the whole publicum, to agree with my idea. So what we need to make sure is that we present, everyone has the possibility, of course, to present their vision, but that it happens within a matrix that everyone has access to, and not only to the factors and the dimensions that I'm interested in my own explanation of my vision, as well as any other factors that the publicum might think it's very interesting. For example, let's think about pedestrian. We cannot think and build up a story on pedestrian traffic without thinking about bikes, without thinking about cars, without discussing the future of mobility with the self-driving cars. So we need to have access to everything, even the functions of the buildings around, so that we can have a better and a very well-informed discussion. That's the point I'm very interested in. I don't have the answer, unfortunately, but what I know is that we need to give access to everyone. And I do believe that the public authorities have some responsibility here.
Mohammed, I'm going to let you comment on it because you actually know how the data has been applied and maybe also made accessible. So I thought I'll just let you comment to Daniel here.
So how to make data accessible is actually a 1 million question, because what I used to do is I go to the specific public space and I count data and I observe data in person. And I do believe in kind of big technologies, that sensors, remote sensors that actually generate data, but you need to be there in person, because there you can actually have a sense, like the accounting people could actually be more deep, you can count the number of pedestrians, but you can also count the number of smiling people. And that actually qualifies what does data mean in that sense. But how to make data accessible, I think big companies do have lots of data, and they have it for their own machine learning. So I think how do you make data accessible in terms of pedestrian, for instance? Probably it's a next level of GDPR. GDPR is a protection, and what we need now is GDPR 2.0 of an exchange of value, where people actually can understand that the data that they produce every day, for instance, is not only a matter of protection, but a value is probably the new oil, where you can exchange it against value. And in that sense, you could generate your data and by just living your everyday life. And then what does that mean to designers is probably a huge, vast of very qualitative data that can actually impact design, but also decision makers, etc. So I think it's a different ecosystem of how we deal with data that actually probably a next step to make data accessible in that sense. Yeah. And for just a last comment to the question brought earlier in the session about yesterday's point that we know a lot about cars and we know less about pedestrians. That is true, but we do know a lot about crowd management, where people can actually escape. And for me, public life is not only about escaping, right? And escaping is only about the average person that actually moves from A to B and escape the place. So what we need to know is to generate more data that actually qualifies the heterogeneous societies where we are differences. We are not average Joe anymore, I think. So we are individuals that have different lifestyles and different socio-cultural backgrounds, and that has to be embedded in the data that we generate.
And that taps really well into your opening statement in terms of understanding the context, I would assume.
Yes, absolutely. I just have one comment to the two panelists, and I think what we've done a lot is to measure what's happening, and I think you should do that. You should go out there and you can measure things, how many things are passing, and you should look at smiles and all of these different kind of things. I think that's extremely important. But when we do things, we should also measure why are people not going there. That's what you can start to do today. So you have different types of initiatives. You are making urban spaces in certain ways. Well, what about all the ones that's not visiting? Why they're not here? And we can measure that today as well. So I think that's just a comment for that.
It's a good comment.
Maybe just in general, I think it's just important to look at why are we collecting the data. Take a couple of steps back. What is it we want to do here? And I think citizens and people should be at the top of the equation here. So why are we doing it? And sometimes you do this indirectly. So you have climate, where you try to make a better climate, less pollution and so on. You have mobility, sharing economy, and all of these things. Circular economy as well. So yesterday I was at another event, and we talked about circular economy. So without data, it doesn't work. So again, it's about the data is just so important in these things. And maybe just one quick example is from Canada, a project I've done on my a real project, I should say, in Canada. And we looked at social services, and they scattered these different social services around the city, but the people didn't show up. And then we looked at where do they actually go, these people we're trying to reach, and that was the libraries, other types of events. So they actually relocated those services to where the people were. So it's just to understand, it's not a big thing. It's quite simple, actually. But you had to look at the data to find out where do we actually have the right services for the right people. So just a brief example.
It's a good example. And Peter, when you were talking about the building and also actually addressing that the data from existing buildings could leap into the next design, I'm curious to ask you also, because in terms of Peter Larsen, in terms of understanding the context, that we also, I would assume, need to understand the building's part in the context of the community. Jakob raised that point, Daniel, I mean, everyone has raised it. So what is your take on that in terms of measuring the operations of a building? How can that play a part in understanding the context?
Now that you're giving me a very simple question.
Yes, that's my role.
Yes. Well, to be honest, I simply don't know.
No?
The reason being that for now, I can find areas where there is an overlap, for instance, in how does a certain building use the grid in terms of district heating, in terms of electricity, in terms of how wide should the road be that comes into to that building. But in terms of how the interaction between how large should the building actually be, how much do we need a lot more information, and we need a lot more integration between these two areas, and how that is going to work. It's not that simple.
No.
I just want to make a comment to your discussions or your input about there is plenty of data out there, and yes, there is, but when we talk about buildings, we very often end up in a situation where there is enormous amounts of data in the building management system, which is absolutely useless for several reasons. Among others, it's too expensive to extract and to realize what it's there for. So we actually, in NCC, have gone a long way in defining a method so that we know what data we are actually collecting, what are the circumstances, what are the sensors that we are using, so we want to, basically, we want to do it again. We don't see a data collection as a one-off project. We see it as something we do in a building that is as standardized as it can be.
I think it's a very, very, very good answer, because it also ties in with what Jakob was saying in terms of the vision, the vision for the sustainable city, where you actually you finished off by reminding us of efficiency of buildings, and also in terms of how to make better use of the square footage. And I know that we talked yesterday, Peter and I had a prep conversation. And one of the things that Peter Weisman has done extensive research on is whether we actually build too big a building, whether we actually need the space. It's not always an interesting, it's not always a popular sentiment to posit.
Don't say that out loud. I'm a contractor. I want to build as many square meters as I can.
Exactly, and now I did it. I'm sorry.
That's fine.
Peter, you actually immediately, you have a...
It's just about because I think Jakob talked about it in his presentation as well. We see with COVID-19 that there's a change of how we go into work that changes the space we use in the buildings. And I think we converted buildings before with adaptive reuse, I think it's called, but now it's different. It's actually existing buildings we need to repurpose, and how can we use them. So I know it's not so much about collecting the internal data, but it's how much space do we use, and how can we then work with architects and other ones to find out how do we utilize that space, which I think is one of the things that will be interesting around the context and the buildings.
Exactly. And it is very good, because the theme of we are looking at the inclusive society and also in cross-disciplinary collaboration. You also got, I have received some questions from the chat, and I will just look at them. But while I do that, you actually got a very good question posed from Jakob. Do you have an example of how data has created a positive impact for people? I thought it was a wonderful question. And you now have had a few minutes multitasking in debating and thinking of Jakob's question. So Daniel, do you have an answer to Jakob's wonderful question?
I have several examples on top of my head. I think the most relevant would be something that actually took place in Denmark. So there is this huge and very ambitious project. It's called UN 17, which aims to actually answer to the UN 17 goals. And the first time the whole project team met and analyzed the proposal, they realized that they didn't have full control over all the living qualities that they thought they had. We are still, within real estate development, we are still using a lot of the experience that we have, which is, of course, extremely positive, but we still do a lot of hunches. We still look at these things like, I have a sensation that I have good control over noise, sun, daylight conditions. And what we realized is that after having the facts on the table, after going through that, the qualities of the proposal that was on the top of the table, that there was a space to do better, to iterate on the design. And that's where something I'm very passionate about, that it's called outcome-driven design. It's all about the performance of the buildings, start to taking place in that meeting. So the architect immediately started iterating the design. Everyone was involved. It was a full discussion with all the stakeholders in the same table. And they understood that they would need to make some buildings a little bit thinner, some others could be a little bit wider. They relocate different typologies that they had, so that at the end, they could have a much more comfortable project. And I do believe that sustainability, it's also about that, is that when we build things, that we think about the whole in a very holistic way. So it's not only about the construction method, it's not only about the design, it must be that we think that these buildings must last forever. I would prefer that we know that we'll never be forever, but if we have this kind of mindset, instead of thinking it's about 40 years life cycle, I think we would be in a much better place. Thinking that it's forever. Therefore, we need to ensure as good conditions and qualities as possible. It's not, we are not up to discussion on that point. We want to make as good as it possible, as the context allows for.
That's wonderful, and it ties very well in with Peter's point in terms of the repurposing, that a building can actually last for such a long time, and then it's upon us to actually take on the responsibility when it has to be repurposed for good use. So I think that's ties in very well. Now, Peter, you have also examples, I'm sure of.
Yeah, I think I already mentioned it a little bit in my last comment, the example from Canada, and when we do basically all the projects we do, we try to put the citizen and the people first, and we need data to solve the challenges. I'll maybe put it a little bit differently. So I've been working with smart city concept for 14 years, and we started off in 2007 to measure air quality. We're still doing that. That doesn't change people's lives. That tells you is the air quality good or bad. When I travel around the world, look at projects, and we need to measure air quality, it's really important. But it only gets interesting when we start to measure the impact of the different initiative. How do we use that information to change something for the people who are breathing in the air? So I work with some startups who is putting that extra layer on that, which is really interesting. So I think it's more, we need to add pressure on the projects we have in the cities, if that's companies or the public sector, and say, now we have measured this, that's fine, but how do we actually make a change for people as well? So just an example of a little bit frustration maybe as well.
That's good. We need that as well today. Mohammed?
Yes. I can actually mention an example that I worked on during the industrial postdoc research with the industrial partner Schulze plus Grasshof. They have had worked on a project in Potsdamer Platz, and which is a development of the public space around Potsdamer Platz. And I think the project started by doing a thorough research about what pedestrians do in public spaces and who is there, and then that was actually informing the design decisions, but that's probably urban design and as usual today. But what happened was I used this data to create a simulation model that represents the everyday behavior that actually was gathered. And what was quite interesting, it was at early stages, but it was that simulation model and the development of the simulation model was used in the stakeholders' meetings. And what does that mean is not necessarily to validate the various design solutions that was presented, but actually it put pedestrian behavior at the table for discussion among stakeholders and clients. And that for me was really interesting because it actually brings back to a certain degree the voice of public in the design team meetings and in the co-creative process. And I think that for me is probably a stepping stone to a good value and a stepping stone to probably a good example of how data could actually bring good to public.
And it also ties in quite well with Jakob's example from Esbjerg and Daniel in terms of the hunches, because some of the things that you've also emphasized throughout your research is that we need to go from gut feelings to data-driven decision making or evidence-based, and so I think that is a very good example. And Peter,
Yes.
you also have to.
Yeah, of course. Actually, a very concrete example that we've been working on a research project where we have installed a lot of sensors in an office building, a newly refurbished office building. And doing that, we actually said, as I have my mantra is, how can we get this data to be something that we can use to take action? And by having this very detailed measurements of consumption in the building, we actually managed over a couple of months to find savings in poor operation of the building. One example of a system that didn't work as it should. Another one was a facilities management decision that went not as expected. And those two things combined actually saved the building owner of something like 200,000 kilowatt hours per year in operation, which is something like 400,000 Danish crowns. We have very expensive electricity in Denmark. That would be something like 50,000 euros. Saved simply by looking at the consumption of the building in a very detailed manner. And that is what we say when we want to make it concrete and actionable, is that simply showing the data, finding out what happens. And it sounds very easy, but it's not, because you need to have a lot of different competences collected and put together. It has to be both the engineer and the facilities manager and the space management people and the IT guys, and that's the point we are trying to make here.
And it's a very good example, because we're actually going to address competences and how to actually work with data in the second round. We have received two really good questions from the audience, and I'm not going to rush through them, but I will read them out because I know that they will, you would like some time to think about them. So from Jonas Strandholt back, and thank you so very much for this great question. How do you incorporate into analysis that users and the use of can and often do change over time, both in city spaces and in buildings? So how do you incorporate into your analysis the changing behavior? And from Mein Rasitz, a really good question, and thank you for raising this, because we'll get back to it. It's what would be the suggestion for cities who don't have a system set up to gather data? What kind of data would be the most important to gather? Number one. How to set up the requests? Pedestrian data, road traffic, parking, wind, natural light, artificial light, parks, green areas, trees, shops, offices, etc., etc., etc. Where to start? I think it's a really good question, and we're not going to rush it now, mine, so stay with us because we'll address it in the second debate. Daniel, unfortunately, you will not be with us in the second round, but we have the honor and pleasure of welcoming your colleague Raoul for the second round of debate. So maybe you can give him a heads up that he's in for some excellent questions from the audience. And thank you so much for being with us here today. It has been a real pleasure to have your insights and also raising the bar that it's not just about the availability of data, but also about the accessibility of data. It's excellent. So thank you for that. And to you with me here physically, thank you for now, and we will see each other again shortly. Because now we're turning to our second keynote speaker, and this is Bjørn Larsen basically introduced you as the startup guy from Backscatter, and I, of course, will introduce you as the Associate Professor Aalborg University, who will be talking about uncovering data sources through soft city sensing. What type of data creates true value for users in construction projects, and are we looking in the right places for the data we need to begin with? I think you're going to answer all the questions that we've been dealing with here, and maybe also some of the tough topics. I also personally love the notion that you are the hybrid of research and startup and experience. It's a beautiful Kinder egg today. So welcome, Anas, and I'll ask you a question. See you shortly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My slides will come up here, right? Or, yeah. Okay, so my name is Anders Krud Madsen. As Pernille said, I'm associate professor at Aalborg University in Copenhagen, where I have been part of establishing a lab called the Techno-Anthropology Lab, where we work on what we call computational anthropology. So we use new types of data sources to understand culture in and around urban spaces. And I've also been part of founding a startup called Backscatter that works with these kinds of methods. So I'm really happy to be able to speak after this. First of all, this super great presentation by Jakob and this great panel. I think when we look at what has been discussed, we have been discussing data-driven urbanism in two ways. So one type of data is about the functioning of the buildings, the accessibility of daylight and so on. And then we have also discussed more what I would call soft issues. So what is beauty to whom, for instance, and what is the social context in which we are building, constructing the built environment. And I think Jakob's case about Esbjerg and the presence of lonely men was a super good example of something that data can uncover. And I really liked Mohammed's phrase that we should think of data as a sniffing sense, that we get. I think Jakob's example with Esbjerg is super good here, that we suddenly get a sense that there's something here that is important to what we build. And so my talk, I think, suggest sniffing maybe in places that we are not used to sniff for data. So I will try to answer the questions like what type of data creates values for users in construction projects. We've already heard really good suggestions for that in the previous talks. But I want to focus more on, are we looking in the right places for the data and the analytical techniques? And I think a backdrop for that is that when we look at how we have been discussing the smart city throughout the last perhaps 20 years, we have been very focused on sensors as a source of data. So the Internet of Things has been a big thing. And actually, when you look at one of the big books on smart cities by Anthony Townsend, he explicitly says that if you think that banal chatter dominates our web today, get ready for the cacophony of billions of sensors tweeting from our pockets. So Townsend is obviously writing at a period in time where sensors have become super cheap. So he's fascinated by the idea that we can now track, like in behavioristic terms, how people move around the city. And that is, of course, super important, and that has created a lot of valuable data that have given insights to the way city functions. But it has also kind of translated the smart city or data-driven urbanism into this kind of scenario where we track physical movements of objects in space, and that's primarily what we use data for in data-driven urbanism. And picking up on these questions about what is beautiful to whom and what is the social context we're building in, I want to suggest that we should try to find value in what Townsend called the banal chatter of the web. Because either you can think about social media and the web as banal utterances, or you could think about it as people living in the city that constantly give feedback on how they experience the city, what they like and dislike, and maybe the single trace of a like or a heart or somebody sharing a picture might be banal, but in combination they might actually be a nice place to sniff for data and get a good sense of what is actually going on the ground in the city. And I think a lot of research in what we call computational anthropology in urban design is moving in that direction now, and there's a beautiful book out now called The Digital City, how media and the social is part of producing places. And I think that's the direction I want to go in this talk. So that of course also, if you look at data now, we just saw the chart of how sensor prices were dropping in the middle of the 2010s. Now we're in a situation where the amount of unstructured data is really exploding, so texts and images and so on that people leave as part of their urban engagement. And my kind of mission is to try to exploit that data or use that data to generate insights about the social context in which we build. So you can think of this data along two axes. First, it carries a lot of what we could call phenomenological potential. It's actually traces of people's engagement with the city. When people share something on Instagram, it's because they find it worth sharing. When they attend an event on Facebook, it's because they want their peers to know that they might be going to this event. It's part of their social identity or their urban identity. So that's one thing. The other thing is that this data is super granular in both in time and space. So we know at what position people have tweeted something or taken an Instagram picture, and we also know at what point in time that was done. And what I term soft city sensing is to use these soft sensors, which is maybe different than the sensors from the Internet of Things, to understand urban life. And I want to give a few examples of how we have been doing that in our lab and in Backscatter, but I also just want to start with I think a really good and very simple example of a map of Louisville, Kentucky, where the municipality had the problem that people were thinking of the 9th Street in the middle of the city as like a mental barrier in the city. So people west of the 9th Street would not cross over to the east of the 9th Street and vice versa. And what they did was pretty simple. They tried to take 1 year of Twitter data and looking at, okay, the people who usually tweet in the west area of the city, where do they also tweet in the east area of the city? So that's what you can see here. The purple dots here are basically people living in the west, and you begin to you begin to sense where would the east actually be acceptable to them as a place to go. And then in terms of granularity, they dive even deeper and they find a specific racetrack and a specific stadium where here you see the brown dots are people living in the east and the purple dots are people living in the west. And you can see actually pretty specific street corners where they meet and interact with each other. And it's not just that you can see that, you can also see what they're tweeting about. So they're tweeting about betting on horses and so on. So you identify a specific little social context that actually does what the city wants the city to do, namely bring these two sides together. And I think that is a good example of sniffing. It's not hard evidence in the sense that it's the final say in this, but it's indicating a place to go and, as Mohammed said, maybe be on the ground, talk to people and understand why is this pattern emerging here. Here it kind of suggests a need for more nuanced understanding of the 9th Street divide, not as a fixed border, but as a border that is sometimes broken by people. I want to talk about two collaborations that I have done with practitioners in urban design, and where I've tried to bring this concept of soft city sensing into their work. So one project is a project I did with Bjarke Engel Groups and SLA Landscape Architects, and the other project is with the Gale Architects. And I think they showcase how you can work with soft city sensing in concrete projects. So the first project was a project we did for an area of Copenhagen called Jernbanebyen. This is an area of Copenhagen that is not yet turned into a city. Right now it's a city for maintenance of trains. So this is a visualization of how we envisioned the city to be if we were to win the tender, which we didn't. But I still think it serves as a good example of how you can use these types of methods to actually guide concrete projects in sketching new urban areas. So this was our attempt to visualize the future city, but in the call for tender by the people building the city was this phrase, that the generations that will grow up and move into Jernbanebyen will not separate between the digital and the physical space. They will experience the digital and the physical city as one. So basically, they're rephrasing the points that I just made about the digital layer of the city also being part of co-producing the place in which people live. So one of the first things we did when we were to try to understand what is this area and how does it connect to the other areas surrounding it, we turned to Instagram as a first sniffing source, as a first data source that we thought this might give us an interesting hunch about what do people already value in this area and how does it integrate with other surrounding areas. So what we did concretely was that we took down the last 1,000 pictures from this area and from the surrounding areas, just to get a sense of how are people actually portraying this area right now before it's developed, and how does the pictures that people are taking in this area connect to the pictures they're taking in the surrounding areas. So just to give you a concrete sense of what we did, we took these pictures and then we ran them through an artificial intelligence algorithm that detects what is on these pictures. So for instance, when you run the first picture here, through that algorithm, it will tell you that this is a picture of leaves and tree and wood and nature. And when you run the second picture through the algorithm, it will tell you that it's a picture of a tunnel and some lighting, and it's a subway. So that already shows that these image recognition algorithms are getting increasingly good at detecting what is on pictures from urban environments. So scale is not an issue when you want to look at pictures. What we then did was that we tried to find groups of pictures that were similar. So we turned these pictures into a network where pictures like, for instance, these two pictures of the tunnels would appear close to each other because they share an urban image. So they're both images of a subway tunnel. And while running over all the pictures, we were able to then begin to identify what we called visual identities of the area. So for instance, here the picture you saw of the tree with the leaves and the wood, it would be located together with a lot of other pictures that had similar urban images on them. So we had a whole set of pictures that were taken in this area that portrayed urban nature in a very specific way. And that was what we used to then identify what we called 7 strong visual identities that were already present in this area before we started even doing the first sketch of what we wanted to build in the area. And those identities were urban nature. There was a lot of pictures of specific buildings in the area that people found value in that we would then obviously not destroy in the new plan. There was also a lot of fascination with the industrial heritage of the area. There was an extreme amount of pictures of the tunnel, which was then seen as maybe something positive, like a way of entering the area instead of something that is negative for the area. And then there were pictures of social life, pop-up art galleries, and food. And what is interesting here, what we tried to do then next was to ask, okay, the way people take pictures of these things, how does that relate to the way they take pictures of the surrounding areas? And then we actually found out that all the pictures that portrayed food and art were taken by the same people or had the same visual image as people who were taking pictures at Vesterbro, which is north of the area. But actually the people taking pictures of the industrial heritage, they were also taking pictures in the south of Copenhagen, which was surprising to us because that was not the way we had imagined turning this area. So we began to trace that and look at, okay, the people who take pictures of these things, where in the surrounding areas do they take similar pictures? And then we began to kind of sketch ways in and out of this area that would kind of, where we tried to follow the engagement or the way people were actually portraying this area to begin with. And that led us to like very specific design specifications that we would, for instance, we had to take advantage of what we called the hidden track down to the old South Harbor that we saw were were particularly important to people, which was something we hadn't really thought about before. And then we began to trace how are people taking pictures of this, and what would that way in and out of Jernbanebyen, how would that look like? So actually that moved our sketch of the area quite a bit, because one of the first sketches we did of the area had a parking house that was actually blocking that road down to the old hidden track to the South Harbour. And the thing we ended up doing had a much more welcoming area towards the South Harbour, where people were invited in through urban nature that reminded of the way people took pictures of urban nature in these areas. So that's an example of how we tried to turn this into a concrete specification for our design. The other project I want to briefly talk about is a project called Do You Live in a Bubble? And I think Jakob will share the link. We have an interactive dashboard for this project, and it's a project that started with an interest in how people sort themselves politically in cities. So there's literature that suggests that we are basically segmenting ourselves into like-minded areas, and we want to try to find out, is that true in Copenhagen or not? And what we did was that we took Facebook data from all the political pages in Denmark. That was around 400 pages with 300,000 posts. And then we looked at how people interact with that political content. So we had more than 500,000 unique users on Facebook engaging with political content. And then the next we did was that we asked, so first of all, this 500,000 users, we tried to bucket them into different political categories in Denmark. And then we asked, we also have around 200,000 urban events in Copenhagen in this dataset. So that would be soccer matches in the football stadium or art galleries. And we know that people are attending these events as well. So we looked at how are these events faring in terms of political diversity. So we thought the perfect concert would look like this. You would have people from the left wing and from the right wing together, whereas the worst political silo would look like this. And then we turned that into a map of Copenhagen, which is interactive, and it's online, where you can click on every venue in Copenhagen and see its political breakdown. So here we have a spa, for instance, that succeeds in attracting across the political border. And that, of course, raises a lot of questions about GDPR and privacy and anonymization. We can take those in the chat. But the important thing here is that began to lead to quite concrete hunches. And again, this is like the sniffing sense, like what actually makes two areas of Copenhagen different in terms of the way they attract a politically diverse audience. So on the right, or on the left here, we have Nørrebro, which is almost exclusively catering for the left wing. And then on the right, we have an area around Sundby Østerplads on Amager, which is very diverse and attracts across the political divides. And we began to ask questions like, might the greater mix of amenities in Sundby Østerplads actually play a role? We can see that it's much more diverse in the types of urban amenities that are available. And we also began to ask questions about urban housing, like the different types of urban housing. And that is, of course, something that could play into municipal strategies of how you design and zoning legislation and so on, in terms of that maybe being a leverage or a lever to ensure political diversity in urban areas. So to conclude, why should urban planning look to soft city sensing? I think it's kind of a supplement to the more sensor-based Internet of Things-driven smart city. It's an extremely interesting source to understand and map the human and social ecology in which buildings are embedded. And I really encourage us to stop thinking about this as just banal chatter or something that is just virtual. I think it's something that is deeply embedded in the way we use our cities and represent our cities. And this could maybe, as in Louisville, challenge and explore urban imaginaries and mental maps that might impact people's use of the cities. So I think that's almost 20 minutes, Pernille. So
it's right on the dot, and thank you, absolutely formidable. Thank you so very much. Before you go, because there are one thing in terms of the social identity that I think is quite interesting. And as we have been through, and we are not through the pandemic yet globally, but what actually happened in Denmark, and I believe elsewhere as well, was that we started naming our walking routes based on the infamous Camino. So in Copenhagen, we now have our own Amamino, I think it's called.
Yeah.
And one thing that I noted throughout the pandemic in terms of Instagram was that people, and tweeting, people had an incessant need to share how many kilometers they had walked.
Yeah.
So just to because you will not be part of our panel debate, but I'd just like to ask you the questions in terms of the value of soft sensing to the wonderful question that we were posed by in the chat. How can we gather data that also documents the change over time? And
but that's one of the nice things about these data sources is that you can run them over time, right? So, for instance, Instagram has an API, it's called, that you can gather data from, and you can do it also backwards in time, so you can go back and look at the changes. And actually, one of my PhD students, Sofie Thorsen, is doing that at Gale Architects as an industrial PhD, and looking at the changes in Instagram activity before and during and after the pandemic. And one thing is that you can geo-track where people were walking, but another thing is that you also get a sense of why they were walking, or what were they taking pictures of during their walk. And that's, I think there's a potential in that. It's not a representative data source. It has lots of issues with it in that sense, but it's still, if you think of it as a sniffing sense, as hunches, then I think it's super valuable, because it actually, as in Louisville, guides you to very specific areas that matter to people.
Yes.
And then you can go there and you can do more classic qualitative anthropology.
I think it's a wonderful point, and I also think it ties in with the previous debate where Peter Bjørn Larsen said we also need to ask the questions of the not. Like, why are they not here, or why are they not taking pictures of this? So I mean, the soft sensing, the small hunches, the sniffing, the probing can lead to other qualified discussions. So
and maybe a last comment is that I think there's also a need for developing our own tools for doing this.
Yes.
So right now I've showed examples where we piggyback on social media, which obviously they have their own platforms. They encourage users to share images in a very specific way.
Yes.
So we are also beginning in our lab to develop open source apps for doing these kinds of methods that are not that are also more privacy GDPR compliant.
And one of the things that what your research and what your work has also done is actually falsifying, like documenting this is a myth that is not true. So for example, the diversity issue in terms of the football stadiums. And I think that for all the Europeans and everyone watching the current European Championship, it's nice to know that this is actually a diverse gathering. It brings us together
Definitely.
from every aspect of life.
You could see that one of the most politically diverse things you can do in Copenhagen is to meet and paint banners for the Copenhagen Football Club in underneath the terraces before the match. That's where people meet across Danish People's Party and Enhedslisten.
So it can actually work. It can help us at so many levels. Anders, thank you. It was a real pleasure. Thank you very much. And now you are so good in asking questions. So we will actually go to the questions from the chat. Anders also has a question to the panelists. But for now, I will invite the panelists back. And I am now looking looking to, we need an extra table. And we will also welcome Raul, who is with us virtually. It's very tempting to kind of ask your immediate comment to this soft city sensing, but I'm not going to go down that road. That is too easy, guys, because you got such a wonderful question from the audience before we left. But I'd just like to, before we jump straight into the questions, Raul Lindberg from welcome to, you're joining us from Finland, is that right?
That is right. Hello.
Yes.
Would love to be there with you.
It is really nice to have you with us, and as colleague to Daniel from Spacemaker, it is wonderful to have your participation in this debate. And I'm not going to throw you under a bus because you actually didn't hear me read out the questions. So I'm going to start with these wonderful people here, and we're going to start at the other end today, this round. Peter Weissman, just to make sure that the Peters know who I'm addressing. So you got two tough questions, but let's start with how do you incorporate into analysis the uses and users can change over time? Did you, because I thought that you would be the right person to start off with an answer to that one.
Well, it's a moving target. So of course, we do know that making measurements and doing and sensing what's going on is a dynamic thing, and therefore, well, of course, we will start by having an idea about where are we now, and then we will, of course, adapt along the way and know that our conclusions will change over time. So I see that actually as an opportunity rather than as a problem.
Jakob, what would your take be on it?
I think I have an example, but I think that the conclusion is that we need to combine the quantitative data with the qualitative data. We designed a school, sometimes in Aarhus, it was very much focused on energy consumption, low on energy consumption. And after it had been open for 2 years, I had a dialogue with the municipalities that monitoring the energy consumption. And because I was asking for the numbers, how does the number perform, how does the data perform? And the municipality across all the schools in Aarhus, they're monitoring the energy performance, and they actually was so surprised because we were high in the end. We had a high consumption compared to also with old schools, and we very much discussed with them, why are you so high in consumption? And they asked us, have you done a good design? They said, oh, we have been focused. We have a lot of insulation, 3 layers of glass, all this stuff that we need to build into an energy efficient school. But then I stepped back, and then I called the facility manager or the padel in the school and asked, are you not managing the school right? I said, yeah, we are managing the school now. Why are you using so much electricity? He said, it's because the school are open to 12 o'clock in the evening. When the kids go home, yoga classes are coming in, the classroom are occupied by all kinds of functions. And that's kind of why the schools are performing bad in relate to the data that the municipality are with their KPIs. But again, if we go back and talk about a city or a building that never sleeps, this is very much efficient square meters. So I think that is also understanding of the quantity, what is the KPIs you are measuring data on, and what is actually out there, what is happening out there.
It's a very good example, and Jonas, if you're still with us, I hope that was a good example, or that you find that a sufficient answer, unless any of you have a specific comment. I'm looking at you, Raul. If you also have, otherwise there is a tougher question I'd like to, because it had a lot of sub-questions, so it's not that it is, but I'm going to read it out again, because it's from Marin Rasic, and thank you for. What would be the suggestion for cities where we don't have a system set up for gathering the data? What kind of data should be prioritized? And then it mentioned everything in a city. So it was quite a long, extensive question. What kind of data should be the most important to gather? and how to set up the requests. I assume, Peter, that this is a question you have heard before.
Yeah, I love it.
Yes.
Yeah, because I think that really shows strategically how to do this, and not just put in a lot of data. Some of the I can actually explain some of how we do the projects. So we could normally go to a city or municipality. We go around different departments. Don't talk about data. Don't talk about technology. Just saying, what is the information you need to provide a better service, or to solve this challenge, or sometimes to save money as well. And they start to talk about different types of information. Then we do normally a matrix, different types of projects and departments. What kind of information do you want? And you draw a circle around a lot of these types of information, and you see, where can we get this data from? And you can always get the data. Municipalities are normally like companies as well, in silos. They have financial silos and everything as well. So what we're trying here is to say, if you really want to work with data and smart city technologies, you need to gather what is it we need to know. So that's like a baseline of information. So that's the first part. The next part is, if we talk about an area, to draw a circle around the area and talk to all the companies or other types of institutions now in the area, and saying, what do you need to know? And then if you ask them the same questions, we've done this so many times, you start to, they say, we would like the same. And then at the last time, you put these things together. We all want a better community, we all want better things, and this is the information we need. And normally we come out with a similar baseline of information. Then you have other things, and it's really important to go to and speak to people. It's also important to measure like backscatter. You have other questions, but there's always like a baseline of things. It's a lot about how people move around, why they do it, and how things move around. And it's not that difficult to get that information. And then we can talk along about something about business models, partnerships, and these things. But that's an extremely important first step to do that mapping.
It's a good set the baseline of information. I hope that was, because I know, Raoul, that when we talked in preparation for today, you also have a strong sense that data, and tying in with what Peter has just been saying in terms of baseline of information, that you see that as a way to create a common language. So tapping into as a city that doesn't have a system already, I would assume that you can see, as Peter, that you set a baseline and then...
Yeah, and I would maybe argue also that there's no city without data. I think the data is there. It's all a bit like Peter said, also to understand maybe to what you will need it to, but then also how you can access it. And I really like what I listened to what Mohammed said also about the GDPR 2.0, where you make actually also the data more accessible and centralized to get this data. But I think a lot of the data that is needed for different things is available. It's more of how to access it and get availability. But in that sense, also to understand first what will we need data for before we start looking at where we can get it from.
Excellent. We have, and it is going a little bit in terms of the data, just to try and we have another question from Erki Alto, and thank you for that. Mapping the life of people with different disabilities. That is another how-to kind of question mark. It was raised during Anna's presentation, but in tapping in a baseline of information, it would go both to buildings and cities. How do we actually map the life of people with different disabilities? Do you have any? Is it going back to Jakob combine? Yes, please.
Yes.
Mohammed.
I think that is really an interesting question because it's not everything has to be mapped using technological senses, right? This could be a very anthropological question. So I would say I've published a paper looking at how 6 years ago, looking at Riyadh a city capital of Saudi Arabia and how gender segregation influenced the way people use the city. So how do you map the segregated city, right? So what I did was actually I recruited a number of 50 participants, young men and women, and I mapped their everyday life using a smartphone app, tracking their movement. It's purely ethnographical approach using smartphones, and then over a period of a month and a half, and then you go and trace back, try to understand what does their everyday life mean in the sense. So what I would say is probably here, what you need to do is you have a group of people with the challenges or disabilities, and you map their everyday life, use whatever sensors you would like to use. And then what you need to do is you reflect that mapping based on their everyday life stories, and then you bring that meaning into the table for strategies, for decision making, etc. So I see it more that comes from those people themselves rather than outsiders that actually try to map what a people with disabilities mean. Yeah.
And Jakob?
Yeah, I have a quite funny story about how this work with inclusivity, and one of our first project in US and Canada, it was for Ryerson University, a very diverse university, and we went over there for the interview. And one from the university asked us, how do you work with inclusivity? And coming from Europe, Scandinavia, we know how to work with ramps and big doors. And so no, that is not what we mean with inclusivity. That is diversity, that is gender, that is sex, that is the whole. And we were not used to that as Scandinavian, that was something that. And then afterward we had an industrial PhD at that time that worked with human science, human anthropology. And we sent him over there to do qualifier interviews, and he also found out that there was a scale inclusivity, that we were actually coming from a Scandinavian tradition, designing two big spaces, or what we thought of inclusivity was to see each other, be able to recognize each other, but it was totally different on the Canadian market. It was more to encourage or kind of conquer a space or claim a space within the big spaces. So that actually changed the whole approach to our architecture, bringing those big atriums that we often design in the university building in Denmark into smaller spaces, atriums, where they could actually kind of decorate their own spaces. So that was understanding. That was more like a qualitative understanding of inclusivity and how that affected the design solutions.
It's a very, very good point. Understand what is actually meant in terms of when you're meeting with a client. We have from Thor, and urban development should involve the citizens themselves, and I think you would all agree. Urban data and digital city twin enable opening up of development processes by inviting in stakeholders early. Democratization, the planning and permit approval processes is an element of this. Such open processes also generate valuable data on citizen opinions and needs. Do you have, or any of you, do you have a comment or experience on this aspect? It's actually a very, I think it's some of the ethical aspects that Anders also raised. But do you have any?
I can always comment.
Yeah, excellent.
So, as I said, I worked with data for a long time, and I had something here in Copenhagen called the City Data Exchange, where we talked about what about citizen engagement, the citizen's voice in all of this, in planning and these things. But then we talked about how do we actually do this, and you have the town hall, and you meet them, and you can name every single one of these persons, and you actually know what they mean already. They should still be allowed to do that. Then there was an example from Backscatter where you can see people's opinions that you normally wouldn't ask. That's another layer of that. So I really think there's several steps. So I think you should do what you traditionally do, then gather information from other types of opinion. But then I think the step that quite often doesn't take place is to present all the information that you have gathered back to a larger group of people, because they will be interested. And maybe a very last comment is that when I work outside Denmark, if I've also worked in Riyadh and in Canada and many places, citizen engagement and the inclusiveness means a lot. It's also about trust. So when you start to ask them these questions and you come back to a lot of information. They're extremely interested in that, and sometimes in the Nordics, I'm missing that last step.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Peter and Jakob, you also have a comment?
I would actually like to go another place with this and saying that who is actually the owner of data? And I know that when it comes to a city, it's a different way, but when we are in a building context, who is actually the owner of the data that is being generated? And we believe that it's the person that actually generates the data that owns the data, but it's at the same time the owner of the data that can share this to other people, share this information to other stakeholders that has a way or that has some way to use this data for the greater good, or for actually improving the operation of the building, or for something else. And in that way, I know I'm not responding to the question in terms of people can actually generate or add to the data, but actually the other way around, who has the right, so to speak, to actually access the data and use it, and who has the ability to give that right, is something that is also an extremely important issue to have in mind when talking about the usability and applicability of this. And we are very keen on the way that we're working in NCC, is to say that it's not our data. We should deliver something in return to be able to have this data to analyze for our use. We should deliver some sort of value to the data owner before we are allowed to actually even use it. So we
point.
see
So you're
that
tapping into Mohammed's GDPR 2.0 discussion.
Yeah, but also in terms of where do we deliver value to the people who are generating this data.
Yeah. Jakob?
Yeah, I think also there was a question about this digital twins or digital city twins. I think we are all young guys here, but we are also quite old. I have 4 small kids at home that play Roblox and remember the other game from Stockholm, like where they're building cities together in a virtual environment. And when I kind of monitoring or look at my son playing that's very much about demography and discussing where to build and where to go and where to establish. So I think that's a young generation that have a whole new approach of moving around and discuss and in a digital world, and also how to use data as a currency for discussion. And I think we need to also understand that and go in dialogue with the industry, the gaming industry, like also speaking, that have some other ideas that grow a young generation, that we should not be afraid of that actually they are much better than we are around the table today. We should have brought in a kindergarten instead of like old guys today.
Oh, well, I know that this is exactly some of the things that you advocate as well, in terms of the democratization of data and data as a language. So I'm going to let you comment on these last reflections here from the debate.
Yes, thank you. And yes, exactly. What we are doing also with our platform at SpaceMaker is to make the city planning maybe more collaborative and transparent, so that we have these analyses in one platform and then can share them as well, both with all the stakeholders that is in the process, so that the developers, architects, municipality, but also we have examples where we have used it in public hearings, where we can actually be in the 3D environment, show all the analysis for how the noise will affect the neighboring buildings, or how the wind conditions will affect, or how the sun conditions, all this in the same platform, but also do iterations. So if you have a meeting, you can actually test out different proposals and do different scenarios, as we talked about before. How can we know the usage, and the usage will be as it is now, or the prediction we have? So you can do all this and 100 different scenarios, but get all analysis for them, and then see how it will affect. So
Thank you, and I think it's a beautiful transition into what I'd like to bring this debate to address, because I think we all agree that data can transform the construction industry, and I think just as you are now saying, that we need to collaborate across the ecosystem, but bringing your memory back to when Christina welcomed everyone this morning, and mentioned, as we all know, that the construction industry and city development in general is very fragmented. So just to go into the ecosystem, data can be a common language. I know from Raoul, I still find it fascinating, and we're going to have to, because do we not need translation? We'll get back to that. But I'd like to ask you in terms of, do we have any barriers or challenges to actually let the data transform the industry for the better? I'm also thinking of your visions for the future, Jakob. Do we have any barriers or challenges? Is this easy going? We just have to move along, bring in the kindergarten?
I think of a challenge that is probably at the core of the discipline of architecture. That is, architecture is reductionist by nature, which means that everything is standardized to an average individual. This table is standardized to an average height and an average weight. So I think one of the challenges is how to break that reductionist nature of the discipline while dealing with data that represent, and here I refer to data that represent people with all of these, with all of their heterogeneity. So how can we? It's a paradox, because at the end of the day, architecture, to a certain level, it's about producing products, and those products will remain there and they are the best of our knowledge today, and they will remain there, and they will be subject to the temporal dimension of change, etc., and then they will be renovated. But then how can we get the best use of the heterogeneous data and then break the paradox of the reductionist nature of architecture that represented by the average Joe?
That is some challenge.
I think.
Peter and then Jakob?
Yes. Well, going back, how is this business model that we are going to use, how to get data, is that actually going to look? And I can see a million different ways, and probably some of them will work and a lot of them won't. Most of them probably won't. So the idea is, who's actually going to pay for this data, who's going for the collection, for the storage, who's going to pay for the analysis of it, and who is, again, going back to my previous comment on who owns the data, who actually grants the right for others to access it. Is that something that they should be paid for? Is that something that they should, all of that, and who is actually going to be the person or the entity that is going to have the centralized, or if it's even going to be centralized, but who is going to have the data and can use it across the different stakeholders, because it is a multi-stakeholder thing. It is something that a lot of companies want to keep to themselves because they see a value in it, but I don't see the value in it before we actually start integrating across the stakeholders. And all of that is something that I don't have an answer to it yet. I only have a lot of questions, and I don't really see how we are going to get from the visions and the ideas that data is the new black oil and new fantastic thing to actually making concrete functioning business models. There are good examples, but there are also a lot of other contrary experiences.
And there are also some facts. I know Jakob has in previous interviews also raised the vision that as an architectural company that the accountability could actually be prolonged to be measured and based on the performance of the building. So instead of just finishing the sketch and the building and then we're out of here, that the business model, as you have also in other interviews addressed, that it could look completely different
Yeah.
And I think that is.
I think that is also another answer for Peter, but I think we need to disrupt our own business model. It's not, as we also mentioned before, we are earning money creating square meters, not creating impact, and we should change that business model. Like other industry have been changing, Ørsted have been changing from black energy to green energy. That was a big transition. I think that we should do the same. Not to say that we should design for free, but almost design for free, but designing for impact and take responsibility of that impact that we create, and then we bring data into the value for all kind of for the contractor part, but also for the architectural part. And I think that is something that we will look into the next 10 years, that there will be a transition in the way that we set up our business. Because now we have data, now we have to kind of monitor, and we have to put it into the business model, how to qualify it into our revenue and how we set up that.
And that is one way of addressing the paradox that Mohammed has identified. Would you say?
Yeah, that is the one way. Yeah. I think I have one example that like we did a museum at once for Moskov Museum, a great museum, and it was a big good business case for us, great design. But actually, when we look at data, we can see over the last 5 years that have been open that the people that go there have raised by 8 times to 800%. So instead of saying that we have designed this beautiful museum, we should have said that we will take 5% of all ticket entrance for the next 10 years. People that come more. The new museum compared to the old museum. That would have been a much better business case for us, and we have to rely on that we are creating something that create impact for our client. Yes. But that's the whole mentality that we need to be able to change in the industry. Yeah.
And it is would also be one way of changing the fragmentation that Christina mentioned earlier this morning. And I was wondering, Raoul, I see you nodding. So I was thinking as... from your perspective, would you be interested in that transition of a business model?
Yeah, and I agree, totally agree also with the transitioning of maybe looking more at the qualities as well. And I think one big issue at the moment is that you don't have that much time in the early phase where you actually do those big changes. So when you are looking at only the square meters, you don't have maybe time to look at all the possibilities in the early phase, because it takes time to collect the data, it takes time to do the analysis. And what we are trying to do is, well, to take that away from the users, so they don't have to collect the data themselves. We can fetch the data, we can do the analysis, and then they get that in the beginning, so you can actually get the same square meters, but still do changes so that you get better living quality. And that is, of course, a change that the user or the industry would need to do. And as we all know, this construction industry is a bit slow, but I think that is will be possible with the right tools.
Yeah. And I think it's fair to say, because you've all mentioned this earlier today, that we need to focus on people. We need to focus on the environmental concerns. I found some facts for today in terms of, from a Danish perspective, that 80% of the companies working within the construction industry actually see digitalization as a prerequisite for being able to document sustainable construction. So there is a sense, there is what we would normally say, yes, there is consensus that this has to happen. But as we're getting close to the end, I'd like to say, so we know what's at stake. Jakob started out by that in his keynote. But if we're to go further along the line, how can we make sure that the transformation will actually take place? Like, because we know what's at stake, so how can we make sure that the transformation will take place? From your you've all worked internationally, so you have the context. What would you say, Peter?
I think two things. Where I've worked, where they forgot a little bit about data and technology and the process I mentioned before, where you talk about what do you want to try and achieve, make some KPIs, and then you actually also have the business model, and then you see the results. So that's the first thing. The other thing, just to turn a little bit around, is in 2029 in Denmark, and we are 5 million people, we will have, the government say we should have 1 million electrical vehicles on the street. Imagine what that's going to do for buildings. What's the role of a building in 2029
Exactly.
with that? So that everything is coming. We need to think about that now already. So just another side of that.
Very good point. Anyone? What do we need to do? Mohammed?
I think adding to the first question by the audience, the temporal dimension of change, and I would add to the Jakob's point of changing the business model from a product-oriented to a process that actually entails change over time in the built environment. So we have been used to cities that actually are built and remain as is, and they have their nostalgic, but then today the change is happening faster, and what we want is to maintain a process at the municipal level that actually understand change and react to change. And that is more important than actually thinking of architecture and the built environment as product-oriented, where these products, these streets will remain here for the next 100 years. They might remain, but they might change in their nature.
I think that is a very, very beautiful way to finish this debate. It ties in with Raoul that data can actually be that common language. We need to collaborate. You've demonstrated that today. I would like to give a huge thank to you for taking time out to share with us your vast experience and knowledge. I hope for everyone who's participated in the audience that you've also felt the extreme compassion, commitment to actually changing the cities and the buildings for the better in order to enhance an inclusive society and a sustainable society. Raoul, thank you for being with us from Finland. It has been such a pleasure. Thank you to you.
Pleasure has been all mine.
An extreme pleasure. Anas, thank you for taking time out and answering questions in the chat to help me maintain time in such an expert way. Much appreciated, and for your brilliant keynote. To everyone, you may have noticed that we had a poster earlier today just advocating that you can join the WDBE summit in late September this year. We can just only recommend that. I would like to also thank the partners behind this wonderful community session today. KIRAHub, Ministry of Environment, Finland, Estonian Digital Construction Cluster, ConTech Lab. It has been such a pleasure in organizing the event of today. Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communication in Riel. But most importantly, thank you to you for being with us here today. It has been a real pleasure. So thank you very much. Either whether it is good day or good evening, thank you for participating. We wish you a wonderful day from Copenhagen and BLOXHUB. Thank you.